morning, everyone. I have the tremendous pleasure of interviewing today Wendy Kopp, founder of Teach for America and Teach for All. Wendy, thank you so much for doing this.
Thank you so much.
Wendy has been my colleague and friend and even mentor in this space for almost 20 years. So Wendy, thank you for the whole of that friendship. So I'm not going to do much about Wendy's bio at all, but she was born in Austin, Texas, did high school in Dallas, and then famously went to Princeton University, where she wrote her senior thesis on this nascent idea of a national teaching corps that would actually compete with consulting and law and investment banking for the best talent on college campuses. We're not going to do that story right now, but we have a sea of budding entrepreneurs here at ASU GSV. You had your own real entrepreneurial story with lots of those startup near-death moments. So just tell us a moment for this audience. What were those bumps like? How did you get through?
Oh, goodness. Well, as you all know better than anyone, every stage in the journey is a challenge if you've got big goals that you're driving after. When I proposed this idea in my thesis, I said, we have to start with 500 people, no fewer. A gentleman had written a memo to Sergeant Shriver at the founding of the Peace Corps, making the case that 500 was the number to launch at because anything smaller wouldn't seem nationally important and anything bigger would be unmanageable. So that was the idea. We were going to inspire thousands of people to apply in the first year, train in place no fewer than 500 of them. There was no email at the time, so flyers under doors, but we managed to get 2,500 applicants. We had the 500 people, we had people ready to train them, and we had no money. I mean, this is, I'm sure, familiar. So it was probably April, we're aiming for a school year start, and we had maybe raised $400,000 out of a $2.5 million budget. And I landed a meeting with Ross Perot, and I'd grown up in Texas reading the headlines about this billionaire who cares about education, and I told myself, and I wish I could be this persistent now, that I was going to glue myself to his chair, and I would not leave the meeting until he solved my problem.
Had you gotten in easily to see him?
Oh, this was like letter number 12.
Okay.
This was, again, no email. So this is
right.
like mailing letters, trying to get meetings.
Right.
Anyway, for some reason, he decided to call me based on one of these letters, and I said, I'm going to be in Dallas next week. Can I come see you? Anyway, the point is, I think I was in his office it seemed to me it was 2 hours. He came up with every other person on the planet who was going to give us money, and I kept saying, I know they won't do it. And he finally said, I'll tell you what, if you can raise the other $1.5 million, I'll give you $500,000. And that was the moment I knew. And how many breakthroughs along the now 30-year journey of Teach for America, it's just classic. But That was year one. We pulled it together. We had 500 people start teaching a year after I graduated from college. And that's when, of course, the real challenges began. And we went through a decade of unbelievable challenges on every front, like programmatically. How do we do this responsibly? How do we recruit and select not just anyone, but the people who are really ready for this and train and support them so that they don't just survive in the classroom, but succeed with their kids and learn the right lessons, and go on to be the leaders we want them to be? And how do we manage an enterprise and keep it afloat and all of the huge challenges? But it was those learning journeys, like the first decade of intense learning, that gave us the foundation to ultimately be able to
intense
scale.
persistence. Everybody should remember that 12th letter to Ross Perot. So your early theory of change was really all about transformational individual leaders kind of scattered out into the world who would then do the work of changing the face of education. And you've had tremendous success. I mean, just to talk about a couple people, we have Mike Johnston from Colorado, who's now running for the US Senate. We have Kaya Henderson, who now works for Teach for All, who really presided over such growth and progress in the DC public schools. You've got Brittany Packnett and DeRay McKesson, who were some of the original founders of the Black Lives Matter campaign. Even Jason Kamras, National Teacher of the Year, now superintendent in Richmond. So just do a moment about that original theory of change about transformational leaders. And I want Wendy to do this because she's actually migrated to an adjacent theory of change since then. But start with that.
A little bit. We've just further developed the theory of change, I would say. I mean, the big idea, even from the beginning, was to say, okay, how do we galvanize the most promising future leaders in our country to channel their energy into the arena of working with the most disadvantaged kids? Initially by getting them to commit 2 years to teach, but knowing that those 2 years would change everything. I mean, just like all those folks were applying to management consulting firms and investment banks thinking, I have no idea what I want to do, I'll just do this for just 2 years. But then, of course, they go to business school and back into those firms. So I thought, like, this will change everything. What if the first 2 years were teaching in low-income communities? So that was the idea from the start. And, you know, over 30 years, Teach for America has had now, 60,000 people sign up to do this, and out of 50,000 plus alumni, 80% of them are still full-time in the work. 60-some% in education and others in policy and in and around.
That's really amazing. Yeah, thank you. And I know you love all your children equally, but is there a particular favorite success story?
I mean, what I would say, I think when I think about like what is fueling us on and keeping us going in this, it's really more than anything what we've been a part of. I could tell 20 stories of 20 communities where Teach for America has placed a steady stream of people for the last 20 or 30 years. And I'll just share one, but again, I could share so many others where this came from, because it makes a huge difference over time to channel all this incredible energy into working in low-income schools. So Chicago Public Schools, I mean, kind of famously, a couple years before I graduated from college, the then Secretary of Education, William Bennett, said that this Chicago Public Schools was the worst public school system in America. And it's the fastest improving urban school system today, which is quite remarkable, right? Like fourth, and you read the headlines in Chicago, you'd never guess it, but kids between the years of 4th and 8th grade, so 5 years, are making 6 years of progress. I mean, in most urban districts, they're not even making a year of progress. The graduation rate from college, the percentage of CPS kids who are graduating from college in the last decade has gone from 6% to 19%. So yeah, I mean, we're nowhere near where we need to be in Chicago, nowhere near, but that's really significant progress against an entrenched problem. Now, there are lots of things that contributed to that. I mean, so many things. I think if you get into it and consider, like, what would Chicago public schools be like if you took all the Teach for America alumni out? It would be a different place. 1,000 alumni teachers, 1 out of every 14 teachers who on average are moving their kids 1.5 years of progress in a year's time are TFA alumni. 1 out of every 6 schools has their 80 school principals and another almost 200 school leaders in AP positions and whatnot. They're running more than half of the Noble schools, all of the KIPP schools, and many of the public schools, like many of the fastest improving, highest performing schools serving low-income kids. And then there are so many others, running the Chicago Public Education Fund, the vice president of the Board of Education, the head of socio-emotional learning for the district. I mean, I could go on and on. There are hundreds of them, thousands of them, actually. So that's to be a part of seeing, and I know we get so down on ourselves in the ed reform movement, but we're making progress. If we had any historical memory, we are moving the needle. It is hard. These problems are deeply entrenched. But to be a part of that and contributing to the leadership that's driving the change is the thing that I think is most inspiring.
One of the ways it's so hard is there's a lot of rancor in the field right now. And part of that is that we can't escape the rancor and the politicization that is in our country right now. But you've been at the epicenter of a lot of this. Much less so now that you're doing the international work. So when you reflect back, what are your lessons or what's your advice for all of us who are doing work that puts us right in the center of difficult political moments?
The thing I've been thinking so much about, and Katherine mentioned earlier that our theory has kind of migrated, And really what it is just thinking deeply about what kind of leadership do we need. And I probably personally have gone from kind of an individual leadership model, thinking we just need a lot of individual leadership around the whole ecosystem. Enough leadership will solve the problem, to thinking we need collective leadership. Meaning we need leadership everywhere around the whole ecosystem. Leadership can solve anything. The right union leadership and school leadership and system leadership and political leadership. We've all learned we can bring the whole thing within our control with enough leadership. But it has to be leadership that is, first of all, diverse and inclusive of especially the people who've most experienced the inequities, but also leadership that actually prioritizes stepping up from the individual pursuits and creating the space to build relationships, to have the debates with each other, to reflect, to course correct, to think together about what we're trying to accomplish. We have not succeeded yet in holding that space. And that's what we're really thinking about. How do we develop leaders who will prioritize that?
So, Wendy, you and I have talked about Oakland, California, as an example of a place where you see the seeds of this collective leadership beginning. A lot of problems there as well. So can you just talk with us for a moment about what does that look like to move from a theory about individual transformative leaders to collective transformational leadership?
So I was sharing with Katherine that I was in Oakland last week talking with a few of the TFA alums who are kind of part of the picture there. And actually what struck me wasn't so much that we've succeeded in developing collective leadership, but that there's a desperate need for it. So, this is a place where there really is leadership around the whole ecosystem, a whole bunch of Teach for America alums and a whole bunch of others who are taking on every piece of the puzzle. Running high-performing schools. Even just the Teach for America people are, helping, running major parts of the district, the vice president of the union, the heads of the organizations that are, alongside many others, mobilizing parents, Go Oakland Public Schools, which has brought a diverse coalition of people together to advocate for change. If you drew the ecosystem, you would say there are so many people working at every part of the puzzle. And yet, look at where we are in Oakland. So they just went through, as many people know, this teachers' strike, and they came to an agreement which raised teacher salaries, I hope I have this right, 11% over 4 years. So, we have alumni who've been teaching for years, stellar teachers in Oakland High School who are making, $65,000 a year? You can't buy a house in Silicon Valley on these salaries. This is untenable, and yet that agreement is probably going to send this school system into receivership, so they're going to take it out of local control. They've got a really good superintendent who knows what the fate will be. So this is a mess. All the energy for 30 years on the part of so many people who've been in Oakland even longer than that, the TFA people alongside many others. But you know what the state of affairs is? Instead of talking to each other, instead of coming together and saying, let's get in a room and think about this, the level of mistrust in this city is massive. So anyone, I don't know if I'm hopeful. I think I'm hopeful because it feels like it shouldn't be that hard to come together. So there's such mistrust of anyone funded by anyone. So it's just like you must be doing, so even if you've been the advocacy organization that has written every bill to generate revenue for Oakland Public Schools, still, if you're funded by, quote, billionaires, you are the enemy. So we've just got nothing but rancor, when what we need is, we need those generous billionaires to be talking to the parents and the teachers and the advocates. Can we get together to listen to each other, to understand, okay, because there's always a solution, right? We need to come together to generate new solutions, but we're so busy just...
Demystify, though? Is it we want the billionaires to actually be proximate to the parents and the students and the families we want to serve because the two sides will demystify each other. What are we going to, how are we going to get it?
Solutions. I mean, if you read the article, The Dawn of System Leadership by Peter Senge and others, I mean, they've spent, longer than I, looking across multiple sectors at what drives system change. And their ultimate answer is it's collective leadership. It's bringing together all the parts of the system, which includes the donors and the employers as much as it includes the parents and the student. Like, bring together all the parts of the system so that people can see the whole picture and so that you can co-create new solutions. We need new solutions. What's the solution to this in Oakland? I don't know, but I know we will not figure it out unless we get all those actors together, talking to each other and listening to each other.
So I want to transition us a bit over to the international side of your work, but some of these lessons actually transfer really beautifully. So when you think about an international community that has done this, that has brought together lots of people who would naturally want to mistrust each other, what's an example of where you've seen it working overseas?
Well, first of all, we're early in the journey globally. We've been at this about 11 years. But honestly, I went and visited the Teach for All network partner Ansei Puaiti, which is Teach for Haiti and Creole, about 3 or 4 years ago. And I came back and said to my dear husband, I just saw the better version. And what they've done in Haiti, so the incredible founder of Ansei Puaiti, Nadine Paul Deroli, spent 3 years before she launched in these rural communities where she was planning to work, essentially just building relationships and considering one question with the folks in the communities, which is, what do we want to have be true for our kids by the time they're young adults? So they co-created a vision for what would be true for kids by the time they're 25. And she then worked everything backwards from this, right? And took such a collaborative approach. So for instance, she's recruiting the participants she's recruiting to be teachers are, she's recruiting some of the top recent grads in Haiti. Only 1% of Haitians get college degrees, and 80% of them leave Haiti, but she's getting some of them to stay and do this. And she's recruiting people who meet the same leadership criteria bar, who are already teaching in the schools in these remote communities. And so she's built these mixed cohorts, at the same time investing in the leadership development of the school principals. So 3 years in, just as one example of what that kind of collective relational approach has led to. I mean, whole schools have changed their discipline systems to be a positive discipline system because they realize we'll never get to this vision with this discipline system. So it just shows you what can happen when we create the space and bring everyone, students and parents and educators and others together to consider really where do we want to go. Because it took a lot of change to change those discipline systems, just as one example.
So it was 2007 when Wendy founded Teach for All, and by 2013, you were really out of Teach for America in terms of a day-to-day responsibility, having turned the reins over first to two wonderful people now, Elisa Villanueva Beard, who was a core member and herself grew up in one of the communities that Teach for America serves, is now the CEO of Teach for America. So Wendy is really on airplanes all over the world, all the time. And I feel like your aha moment was when you realized how much we here had to learn from communities around the world. So start just with what you've articulated about how there are more similarities in some ways between some of our kids here to kids overseas than there are between our different groups here in the States.
So just quick context here is that I wasn't thinking about the rest of the world until about, I had my head down because we've got a whole bunch of challenges in the US. And I was just trying to make Teach for America bigger and better, but there was something in the water in the rest of the world. And within 1 year, I had met people from 13 countries who were just determined that something similar needed to happen in their country. So that's really what led to ultimately the launch of Teach for All as a network of independent, locally led organizations in now 50 countries and growing that are all recruiting their own countries, right? Most promising future leaders, asking them to commit 2 years to teach, investing in their ongoing leadership as a force for change. So what got me into this was thinking, I believe in this approach. It's a powerful model. They want to do it. Let's help them. It hadn't occurred to me, because I think I thought of education as such a local issue. In fact, a lot of what was driving us in this work is thinking without deeply locally rooted leaders who are deeply steeped in local context and culture, there is no chance to have transformational change in education. That's the whole point of our organizations, right? Let's develop deeply locally rooted leaders. Ugandans need to solve Uganda's problems, so I'm thinking, great, this is an approach that can work for Uganda. But as we got into this, it didn't take very long, actually. It was really my first trip to India where I was realizing the circumstances of the most marginalized kids in India are more similar to the circumstances of our most marginalized kids here than they are to the more privileged kids in their own country. And once you realize that,
go deeper on that for a moment. What do you mean by that? Because that's a pretty powerful statement.
Because it's kind of the roots of the issues we're addressing are eerily similar from place to place. Meaning, so you've got whole segments of kids who are just facing a whole bunch of challenges that the other kids in their countries are not facing. And those challenges can differ, but often they're functions of poverty, inadequate nutrition and health care, all the stresses that come from poverty, inadequate early education, discrimination, racism, depending on the cultural context, but you've got a whole segment of challenges. And then those kids show up at schools never set up to meet their extra needs, and of course these schools don't even have as much resources as the ones that... And then you've got this prevailing ideology of just low expectations for kids. So once you realize, wow, the roots of the issue, and we have one theory of the problem across Teach for All. Of course, it's contextualized, but we've all agreed on this. This is the picture, right? So that the silver lining in it, I spent 2 years in this global journey being really depressed, feeling like we're fighting the forces of gravity everywhere. Because even the politics are the same. We think ours is unique, and we have a pretty tough situation in the US, but there are such patterns on every front, and you feel like you're fighting the forces of gravity until you realize the silver lining is, what if we were learning from each other across borders? What if local education leaders had the chance to understand what was working and see what's possible in other contexts? We could be moving so much more quickly. I actually think this is the only shot we've got at getting on a meaningfully different trajectory in our lifetimes, is to figure out, how do we do that? How do we enable, both the cultivation of lots and lots of local leadership, but enabling them? How do we build the infrastructure that enables them to learn from each other across borders?
And have you seen some of the same issues we have here when you're overseas about incipient efforts to really dismantle hierarchy and empower a whole new group of people?
Honestly, actually, I'm going to Mexico right after this because Teach for All is doing a conference in Mexico. And, it's just a beautiful example of an organization that's basically concluded the only chance we've got to pull this off, because they're thinking, how do we foster the leadership of our students? Like, the students in our classrooms today are going to have to be the ones who very soon are going to be navigating the changing economy and solving these increasingly complex problems. So we need them to be growing as leaders. Like, they're not going to sit in rows and passively receive information and suddenly be doing that. So we need to unleash our students' leadership. So they quickly embrace this kind of student-centered approach. And then they realized, we're not treating our teachers like that. And actually, we're not treating our staff members like that. So if we don't figure out how to operate in ways that unleash the leadership of everyone, we'll never get where we need to be with kids. And I have to say, I don't know how many people heard Reed Hastings last night, but when he was describing the lessons from his journey running Netflix, increasingly lose control, or he probably framed it more, so that ultimately you've got a whole bunch of leadership everywhere able to navigate. Literally, it's like the playbook for what must happen in this work of ours. Like, we will not, and I think the US educators, we need to really consider what we're working towards for kids. Are we trying to grow our students as leaders who can reshape the world? Because if not, there's no hope to get anywhere else where we want to be. I think that's our goal. But if we're going to do that, then we ourselves in our own organizations need to operate radically differently than at least I've seen us operate the last 2 or 3 decades. Like, we need to figure out how to unleash leadership of our teachers, the school leaders, the staff members in our organizations if we're going to accomplish that.
And just one last question on international, and then we unfortunately will need to wrap up. So there's such biases here that I'm sure you have dealt with that we just wouldn't necessarily have anything to learn from overseas. So do you have one final favorite example of something we can learn from others? And just to frame this for a moment, I've actually visited Teach for All schools in the Philippines, where the average class size is about 65 students, and they have so many kids that they are taught in 2 shifts, one morning shift of 65 kids and one afternoon shift. Huge perspective difference coming back here and understanding our fights between 16 and 25 in a classroom. So don't comment on that necessarily, but what has the perspective given you that has helped you understand our problems here better?
It's interesting, because I think what happens is, every culture is different, and of course there are brilliant people all over the world who, in different cultures and contexts, are innovating new solutions and whatnot. I wouldn't say it's, I think that nothing we would see would be Greek. It's not like, wait, what are they doing over there? We're all we're addressing the same issues everywhere. You realize that. But what you realize is how someone's focus can just be sort of different. So, I just spent a week in India, and actually similar to the Mexico example, they've just decided we've got to elevate student leadership. Like, this is going to be about the leadership of our fellows and our alumni, but this is going to be about student leadership. And they're rethinking everything with that paradigm. How do we partner with our students to reinvent our education system? And I have to say, I actually took my own daughter, who is 11 and goes to a very progressive public school in Manhattan. And her I'm not sure she's going to be able to finish her 5th grade year without going into battle with her own teacher. Her entire frame is different. there's so much that we could learn. I wish I could ship this whole room to India and we could just essentially immerse ourselves in the work that they're doing, because it's not so different, and yet it is so different. It's like around the margins. So there's just so much we can learn by taking a more global approach than we have.
But you have to be proximate to do that. So Wendy, we are out of time, but I'm going to throw you one last little question. So really and truly, as a human being, Wendy is Superman. She is on airplanes everywhere. She's the mother of 4 children, including that daughter who just went to India. So you have worked so hard building 2 big organizations. Your spouse, Richard Barth, runs the KIPP schools. Do you ever just sit back and think, wow, what would it have been like if I'd just done private equity?
I would have been the most disastrous private equity person. I feel very lucky, honestly. I don't know how. It was this idea just struck me, and I'm so grateful, because I never would have guessed I'd still be pursuing it 30 years later. But it just got me into this arena that's enabled me to work with such incredible people against something that matters. So I'm not sure. I knew I wasn't made to work in banks. So I think I just found my calling early.
And that's a wonderful note to end on. Please join me in thanking Wendy Kopp.
Thank you.